I am so excited to see you, Helen. I mean, partly, this is the first time this century. I think the last time was 1999. And even more, I think you know this, but not everybody does. I've spent the last 12 months just reading and rereading, reflecting on, and laughing over your book that comes out today, Lotus Girl. And I don't think there are many recent books that I would volunteer to fly all the way across the country to learn more about. But this is a really rare and special work. And you grew up amidst de Kooning and Rothko and Charles Mingus, and you take us to Kyoto and Cambodia, Kathmandu in 1965. But I feel at heart this is really a simple human story about the encounter between the modern West and this very powerful form of medicine known as Buddhism, and the misunderstandings, the frustrations, maybe especially the liberating possibilities that arise out of that. And for me, it's definitely the most mature, balanced, and thoughtful book on that meeting I've ever read. So thank you for that. I can really feel the 60 years of experience and reflection that lie behind it. So, well, let's begin in New York City. That's where you began. You were born and raised on East 23rd Street. Can you remember now when you first felt that longing towards something else?
It's a long time ago. I remember a longing to get away from what I knew. And that stayed with me for a very long time, long before I had any sense of where I was going, or what I was going towards, or even what I wanted to go towards.
And when did Asia cross your horizon?
I think with the photograph of Kwan Duc, and that's how the book opens, the photograph of Thich Kwan Duc, who set himself on fire in protest of the Diem's crackdown, the government's crackdown on Buddhist clergy. That was in 1963. I don't think I'd ever seen a Buddhist monk before. And I know that I had to read certain books in school, in high school. I think I had to read, what's his name's book? Houston. Yeah, but I don't have any sense of being attracted to it. But that photograph really captivated me, and it introduced me to a whole new world of possibilities. And I think that for many Americans, the photograph has always been associated with the Vietnam War, America's presence in the war. It actually was not. It was a protest against the Vietnamese government. But it's always been associated with that, and that's when people like myself, many Americans, that's when we first discovered that Kennedy had actually been sending in advisors. And that was the beginning. And up until then, nobody really had any idea the extent that we were backing a very, very corrupt government.
And what did you make of the sight of a monk immolating himself in the middle of the streets?
Well, I had no idea what to make of it. It was the thing that was shocking about it was his equanimity. We have seen photographs since then of people self-immolating in protest. In fact, there was one recently in Washington against the war in the Middle East. And we've seen photographs, not so many because they're blocked, but coming out of Tibet. Self-immolations in protest of the Chinese. But I have never seen another one in which the burning person stays in complete equanimity. That was completely shocking and perplexing. Nobody knew what to make of it. And as you probably know, being a journalist, there were very well-known journalists standing at the site. Halberstam was there. And they described their own shock at seeing living flesh turn to ash. But nobody knows what to make of his mind. So it's never described. It's sort of like a non-issue, like, what do you make of this guy just sitting there, completely appears in total tranquility? I certainly didn't know what to make of it. I don't think, but I was captivated by it. And I think part of you mentioned my art world background, so part of what captivated me is that I grew up in this very heady, intellectual art world with these guys, mostly guys, who were supposed to be like the smartest people in the whole world. And I knew that they didn't know what was going on with this guy. They didn't have a clue. And that it gave me a whole alternative possibility.
And you probably knew that they didn't know what to do with a lot of things in life, including suffering.
Yeah, I was figuring that out. Yeah.
And was there a connection between seeing that image and then you went to Asia for the first time pretty soon thereafter, didn't you?
I went to Asia for the first time about 2 years later. And so seeing that photograph was a major influence, and also I had started fooling around with psychedelic drugs. And so those two things together presented Asia as a possible travel destination.
What did the psychedelics give you?
They certainly gave me an experience of a kind of mind that I had never had before, a non-conceptual mind, a non-dualistic mind, but it didn't have any context. And so for me, it didn't have any consequence. They were wonderful experiences, and they were pivotal experiences. I never forgot them, and there was some way in which there was a major kind of orientation that they set up. But I never had any, I never could learn anything from them. I did not trust, I didn't find the LSD guides very trustworthy. That was Leary and Alpert at the time. I think this is actually in the book, that at some point I was talking to my friend Carol Tonkinson. She worked with me at Tricycle at the very beginning, and then she moved to London, and we continued our conversations about Buddhism and Buddhism in the West. And she asked me, because the LSD experiences started the winter before 1963, when Thich Quang Duc sets fire to himself. And she asked me, do you think your experiences with LSD sensitized you to some aspect of Thich Quang Duc's mind? And the question totally startled me, because I had never thought about those things happening in such consequential way. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I suppose. I couldn't really have any kind of clear sense about it. But LSD, in a way, kind of turned everything upside down. So things that looked like they might not be believable somehow became into the realm of possible reality.
And it strikes me, listening to it, it's almost like the difference between seeing a postcard of Rome and being there. In other words, it gives you an intimation of what's beyond,
Yes.
but it's opening the door but not taking you through. And I think in the book you say wonderfully that psychedelics give you a sense of intensity, non-self, and transcendence, but they didn't, you felt, give you a lasting response to confusion and depression. But something else did. I mean, I get the sense in your book that one of the things that really expanded you when you made that initial trip to Asia was meeting the Tibetans in Nepal. Is that right?
Yes.
And what did they give you?
During that period when I lived in Kathmandu for about 8 months in, what year?
65, right?
65. And I worked at a Tibetan refugee camp. And at that time, the situation with the Tibetans was very, very raw. The Chinese had come in the 50s, many of them left in 59. And there were people still crossing the Himalayas to come out. And they would arrive starving and ragged at these camps. And what I saw was a people whose culture was being decimated. Their families were being killed. The monks and the nuns were being killed and tortured. Their temples were being burned. And there was a lot of sadness. There was a lot of grief, a lot of tears. But they also simultaneously could hold a tremendous amount of joy. And that possibility had never occurred to me. I grew up Jewish. I was born right in the middle of the Holocaust. I had some sense that suffering was a very noble and valuable thing, and you should never give it up for anything. And the possibility that you could actually become bigger than your own trauma was completely mind-boggling to me. And I kind of intuited it had something to do with their Buddhism, but I had no idea what.
And the notion that loss is not incompatible with joy. In other words, we're not living in a world of binaries.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I had thought we were.
Yeah.
I had thought that, and not only did I understood that there were certain traumas that would never be overcome and could never be, and that they were sort of inside you as some kind of, inner, like your heart or your lung, some part of like something that could not be moved. And then I discovered that wasn't quite true. It's not that it disappears, that you change the shape of it. In fact, in the book, I tell a story. It's one of my favorite stories about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because it always reminds me of the camp. At one point, a French journalist, he tells a story about an old monk who comes to see him and asks about doing a very, very demanding, rigorous practice. And the Dalai Lama says to him, "This practice is too rigorous for you. I'm going to give you a less rigorous practice," which he does, and the old man goes away. Monk, he's an old monk. And then His Holiness learns that the man commits suicide because he wants to be reborn sooner so he could do the more rigorous practice. That's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is that the French journalist then says to him, "How did you get over this?" And the Dalai Lama responds with absolute incredulity. He can't believe the question. He says, "Get over this? You don't get over this." So what did he mean by that? I don't know. I have my own interpretation. But it felt like you don't get over it, but it doesn't define your life. It doesn't take up all your energy. It doesn't loom big in your head as the only thing that ever happened to you, as so many people in my own life and among my own friends had that experience where they felt that suffering was like the biggest aspect of their minds and bodies. So it's like, how do you get over this? You don't get over it, but you accommodate it in some way. Does that make sense?
Makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
Because I think you describe yourself in the book as quite an unhappy young woman and girl. And I suppose this opened a window to the fact that that didn't have to be the totality of your experience. I thought you were going to tell that equally wonderful story about the monk who comes to His Holiness and after, I think, 20 years of being in prison. And His Holiness says, were you ever frightened? He says, "Yes, there was one moment I was really scared I might lose my compassion for my captors." And the sense that fear could be defined like that also expands the mind quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then how did your sense of how Buddhist practice could actually change the way you live and think or not think? How did that evolve from there?
Well, I would say in relation to what we were just talking about, the biggest learning curve was to discover that how much of the mind, your own conceptual mind, actually manufactures the suffering that you think is intractable. That was a big shock. And also because it so pushes you back on yourself, and all of a sudden you have to take responsibility rather than keep blaming your mommy and your daddy and all the people who did terrible things to you in your life and your government and everybody. And the idea, I mean, to my understanding, even today, that's a radical idea. Even today. Maybe more so today than ever. I see so many young people, they just can't stop blaming their parents, the government, this side and that side, and this military and that military. Everything is blame. Everything's on the outside. And so one of the core messages in Buddhism is that you take responsibility for this suffering. It doesn't mean that what's going on out there is not wrong or bad. But the suffering that you experience is something that you can work with, and you don't have to be stuck with it.
Mm-hmm. I think both, or at least two of the times I read your book, I started transcribing the same sentences in the same paragraph, where you're talking about when you went through therapy, there was an emphasis in that discipline of who's to blame. And I think you say, as long as you're blaming somebody, the poison stays in your system. And it made me think of the Buddha saying, if an arrow is sticking in your side, don't ask whence it came or what kind of arrow it is, just pull it out. Find the cause, the suffering. And I'm guessing that's one of the things that quickly...
Yeah, he talks about the two arrows. So the first is the arrow that pierces your body. The second arrow is you're lying there going, why me? And that's the distinction between the pain and the suffering.
Yes.
The suffering is, why me? Who did this to me? How am I going to get that guy? I'm going to sue that guy. I'm going to blame that guy. I'm going to beat him up. I'm going to blah, 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 blah. That's the suffering.
Yes, and actually in your book, you enact what you just described in the sense that I think you're you're at odds with the United States when you leave it and go to Asia. It's in the middle of civil strife. It's involved in the war in Vietnam. There's so much to dislike about the US in the mid-60s. And actually your travels helped you not blame America, too. I mean, it brought you to a richer understanding of certain things we do have in the way of freedom, for example, that many people don't.
Well, I think I had never thought much about what it meant to be an American until I got outside my own country. And I think that's not so untypical.
No.
And so, and you live in Japan, so you would know that this. One of the things that happened when I was in Japan was people not believing that I was American because my name was Russian. So if your name is Russian, if your father came from Russia, Poland, that makes you Russian. And I kept saying, no, I'm an American. And they absolutely couldn't get it. I was a Russian, or where I didn't even know what I was, because my father came from that part of Russia-Poland border that went back and forth, and because he was Jewish, he wasn't either one of them. He didn't identify with either of them. I couldn't explain that to these Japanese people either. And but I did develop a tremendous appreciation for having a nationality, because I realized that so many people, especially among Jews, did not have that nationality, and they had no sense of political home or any kind of home. So I don't think I had that appreciation for my status in this country until I traveled.
Am I right in thinking you trained as an anthropologist?
Well, I don't know if you would call it training, but I did study anthropology right down the street here at Hunter College.
Yeah, because, I think the book is lit up by an anthropologist's eye. And one of the things that I delighted in is you had this front seat view in Kathmandu in 1965 when the first Westerners were discovering the East. And you say, for example, suddenly there were Westerners in Buddhist robes, in yogi robes, in bathrobes, in kimono, and in no clothes at all. And there were comical aspects that you saw.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to do with this book is to expose some of the humor. I mean, it was, my generation of Buddhists, it was not a straight line of meeting fabulous teachers and practicing and sitting in monasteries. There were those people among us, and some of them are here with us tonight. They were very serious students of Buddhism, and they understood the invitation that Buddhism offers long before I did. But a lot of us we were having a lot of fun, and we were very confused. Both,
Yes.
All those things.
I think at one point you say we were innocent, sincere, and ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're very, very tough on yourself and on your friends. When certain misunderstandings arose or problems between, let's say, the Asian teachers in this country and the Western students, it sounds as if at times you felt the students were responsible for the misunderstanding. Is that a fair assessment? By projection or
I don't know that I don't know that we were responsible. We got so many things wrong. I mean, we were so naive.
Yeah.
Maybe in that sense, we were incredibly naive, and if we were responsible, I don't know. Say something else about that.
Well, another way of putting it is, I remember actually I wrote a really long article for you in the year 2000, 24 years ago, about how, in my understanding, living in Japan, the notion of a teacher in East Asia is quite different from the notion of a teacher here, and the notion of a self is very different too. So it's a hard translation suddenly to take these Asian practices and put them into America based on very different assumptions. So each person's going to get the other wrong to some extent, which I think you more or less said. But also the sense of romanticizing the other. So I just reread for the first time in 30 years your book on Zen in America, which is about 5 American teachers of Zen in North America in the 1980s. And it seemed to me that once there's an American teacher, there's much less danger of romanticizing the teacher and falling in love with the robes rather than the teachings.
I think that's true. Yeah, absolutely. But also, it was a different time. You know, by the time we had American teachers, the Asian teachers, or some of them, had already been here for 20, 30 years. So, and we were 20, 30 years older. So all of that factors into it. But we certainly idealized the teachers. We had lots of different ideas about the guru, especially in the Tibetan tradition, more so in the Tibetan tradition than in the other traditions. To some extent, that exists today. We also had incredibly, I think, let's just say, the ideas we had about enlightenment at that time were different than the ideas we have today. I don't know if the ideas we have today are more accurate or not, but they're quite different than you know, we used to have this idea that if a teacher, a guru would be enlightened, and that would be a kind of fixed, static place. And there could not possibly be any backsliding. It was like an alchemical transformation that happened that could never be undone in any way. So I think at this point we pretty well, I think there are people actually who might still believe that, so I don't want to be too general here, but many of us don't. We have a very different understanding of what the awakening means, of what enlightenment means, of what it means to have a teacher. All of this has been a very fluid, fast-moving development over the last 30 years, 40 years, 50 years.
Yeah, actually I've been waiting 12 months to ask you. As you said, you grew up in this rather heady art world. Your father was Jack Tworkov at the center of the abstract expressionist movement. So very early on, you saw that artists weren't special. And I'm guessing you saw that artists were flawed, very imperfect human beings who nonetheless could be vessels for great beauty and transcendence and could offer us something special for all their flaws, the way Mozart or Picasso does. Do you think that's the same with spiritual teachers, that they're very fallen human beings, but nonetheless they give us a sense of something beyond that other people might not?
I've been thinking about that. I somehow intuited, of all the times you told me, I was thinking about a question for you today, of all the times I tried to imagine what that could be, I sort of intuited that might be one of them. And I've been thinking about that, and one way to understand it is what you're looking for. I mean, what you look for changes. You know, what you look for in a teacher, what you want from a teacher shifts in your life. When I was a child, I had no appreciation for what the artists were making. I didn't know anything about art. I saw that the artists themselves were very flawed human beings. So from a very early age, my view was, if this is as good as it gets, and I grew up in a society that communicated that this is as good as it gets, I just said, fly me to the moon. I don't want to be here. But I didn't. That was not balanced by any appreciation for art. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't particularly want to know anything about it. But the teachers, I think some people really need a teacher who they like, whose personality they resonate with, whose ethics they, quote, approve of in some way. Other people really want to use these people as vehicles for the teachings in a way that can respond to their own needs. Those are not always the same person. So I think it's very variable.
That's a beautiful distinction. And I was also thinking, in Japan, for example, of course, a Buddhist priest is mostly serving a ritual function to do with funerals. But my guess is that a spiritual teacher is a little like a violin teacher, somebody who's with great developed talents in certain fields, but you don't expect him to be necessarily a moral exemplar or to be wise on every front. And I was thinking maybe that's the kind of thing that sometimes gets lost in translation too.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, and I also think, in our own country, it's such a celebrity culture. So you ask baseball players what they think of politics. I mean, this happens all the time. We're reading statements of celebrities who know nothing about what they're being asked. So I think that's just as true with the Buddhists. I mean, there are very funny stories. I mean, some of the best are told by the teachers themselves. These celibate teachers come over, the next thing they know, they have Americans crying on their shoulder about their sex lives and their marital problems. They're like, I don't know. I'm really like, you're talking to the wrong person. And it's, so, and then they got their psychotherapists all mixed up with their teachers. So, and the teachers are like, but now that some of those same teachers have now been around us for 20, 30, 40 years, they figured it out. I mean, they figured out how to say no. They figured out how to say, I'm not the right person to talk to about. They figured out how to say, maybe you should see a therapist. I mean, all of these are now in the mix.
Just like a regular doctor, general practitioner.
Exactly.
His job is to know when you need a specialist. And I always think one of the most powerful things that Dalai Lama says is, I don't know. And people are often asking him about kids, for example, raising kids. He said, I'm a celibate monk. He's the worst person in the world. Most people in his audience probably know more about that than he does. What do you think have been, it's famously every culture creates Buddhism in its own image, as it were. So Buddhism is very different in Thailand, Sri Lanka, Japan, and Tibet. What do you think is the great contribution of Western Buddhism?
Number one, women.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. No, it's true. It's not a perfect situation at this point, like every other part of the society. It's a work in progress. We're getting there. We're a lot further along than we were 50 years ago. We have a lot of work to do, but it's getting there. And on the part of the communities and on the part of the teachers. Big learning curve for them. So that's certainly one thing. I think the psychology is another huge one that I've been thinking about a lot lately because, Buddhists and psychologists have been talking to each other since the 50s. I think in the rather well-known Zen books on people who are practicing. And when D.T. Suzuki was teaching at Columbia in 1950, he drew the attraction of some very famous psychologists at that time. But I think that there's been another shift that's come out of this psychology, excuse me, that has to do with embodiment. That for a long time there was this view in Buddhism of sort of a mind-only, experience that was somehow separated from the body. And I think more and more, even among teachers who have been steeped in traditions that do not acknowledge the physicality of their bodies, there's been a huge shift. And I think part of that is that a lot of, I'm speaking now specifically of the Tibetan teachers, at some point they realized that we were way ahead in terms of our intellectual learning than we were with our actual shifts in behavior. And that there was a certain way in which the teachings had not been, quote, embodied. But there's some way in which we had circumvented certain aspects of how we felt, a felt experience. That was, there are plenty of teachings to demonstrate why this would be true, but it's changing now, and I think thanks to the Westerners, that the feelings and the head are not contradictory. They're completely integrated, and it took a while for all of that. And I think it's getting worked out now in a very interesting way by some very interesting teachers.
And that makes me think of engaged Buddhism, taking Buddhism into the streets, which I think is happening more on this side of the world than that. Would you agree?
I don't know where that's at right now. I mean, certainly it was a very big subject for a very long time. But as Buddhism has become more and more secularized, I don't know that it has its special spot, but it might. I don't really know.
And I feel lay practitioners, as it were, who aren't full-time monks but have a very serious commitment to Buddhism, is something I see certainly more in this country than in Japan. I'm also thinking about motivation. I know a lot of Zen teachers who say that the reason they want to bring the discipline over here is they feel a real hunger. People are super, committed to trying to learn it, which is not so much the case, I think, in Japan, where traditionally a man becomes a monk or a priest because his father was. It's just a family business, as it were. But here there's a real, it comes through in all your book, wholehearted motivation, which is maybe the best part of the Western seeker. Of course, because this is a memoir, there's a lot about your mother and your father and your sister. How do you think Buddhist practice has helped you understand them or get on better with them?
I know, my sister's sitting right there.
Okay. Dangerous question.
Well, the biggest impact was in relationship to my mother, because she had a very, very difficult childhood, which she never talked about. And there was this whole secret in my family, which is in the book, so it's not a secret anymore, that my mother's mother had been gone to live in an insane asylum when my mother was very little. And my mother thought that my sister and I would be better off for not knowing this. So we were told that she had died. This was the big family secret. And there was a lot of confusion, to put it mildly, around that and how she navigated that big lie. And when I told the story about the Dalai Lama saying, how did you get over it? My mother never really got over her childhood trauma, even though her life on the outside was very, very, very different than anything she grew up with. Grew up on Elizabeth Street in Manhattan and then moved to the Bronx. And I even when I was spending a lot of time at the Tibetan camp and thinking about her a lot in terms of suffering, because I got the idea that suffering was this wonderful, noble thing from her. She would denounce the word fun. She would make fun of the word fun, like it was the stupidest thing she ever heard of. And but I could never really hold her responsible for her own suffering. I just didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to hold myself responsible for myself, so I couldn't hold her responsible for it. But it certainly gave me a different understanding of her life than I had had. Mm-hmm. I don't know if does that answer your question?
Beautifully, yes. As I listened to you say all that, was it difficult for you to write this book?
Well, it didn't start off being difficult because I had no intention of writing about myself. So, and then, I have a friend who works in publishing who read an early draft and said, "This is a very interesting memoir. It's a memoir by someone who doesn't want to talk about themselves." But I wanted to write something about Buddhism in America, and I wanted to capture something about something about the confusion, the naivete, the humor, the craziness of it, the craziness of the times. Because in the books that I had been reading, they basically, in the histories, and I'm sure there might be a very good one that's come out in the last 20 years that I just haven't read, but some of the ones that I read from way back, they kind of follow the history the way a lot of histories are written, which is to go from one great man event to another. And the peasants and the working people and the working bees and everybody in between is just invisible. And I wanted to try to write something about what that was about. And so finally I hit on this idea that I could do it as a personal narrative. But I kept being told that I wasn't showing up on the page. So that when I got the idea that I had to do that, then it became hard. The part writing about Buddhism wasn't hard.
Yeah, I know that feeling. But I think it's really a generational story. Actually, what I like about the book, it's midway between the historical approach and the extremely personal, this is my story. Because it's not really your story. Because at every point, well, so many of the people you knew were on the same path, and it's really about a collective embrace.
Well, I saw it that way. And as I said before, there were plenty of people around who had a much more serious relationship to their practice from the beginning than I did, and who went on to become teachers and so forth. But there were many more like me, you know, taking one step forward and two steps back, and that was our path.
Yeah. And when I first met you, it was 1991, you were starting really the first major Buddhist mainstream magazine in the West, Tricycle. And I got the sense you chose that name, firstly in honor of the three wheels of the Dharma, and partly to remind us all that Western Buddhism was in its infancy. This was a training ground. We weren't ready for Harley Davidsons yet. Was that your feeling then?
Yes,
and what is your feeling now?
Yeah.
What stage of evolution do you think it is in currently?
I think we're still in a pretty young stage.
Are we in the honeymoon? Are we past the honeymoon stage?
I think we're past the honeymoon, but I don't think we're not very old yet.
That's good. Early marriage.
Yeah.
Having the honeymoon stage behind us is quite a triumph, I think, because marriage suggests realism and serious commitment.
Yeah, I think the honeymoon stage kind of broke in the mid-'80s with a series of scandals.
Yes.
And that was a painful time. And every lineage, every major lineage in the United States was having some sex scandal, alcohol scandal, money scandal, or some combination of all of them. And it was a very difficult period, but I think it was extremely helpful, really helpful. It kind of broke that bubble. And it made us, up until then, I think a lot of the lineages and schools were very proud of their own superiority. Everybody had a really great reason for being the very best. You know, the Theravada thought they were the closest to the bones of the Buddha, and they were the only real Buddhist religion, and you know, Zen was always considered off the map in various ways anyway, and the Vajrayana wasn't even Buddhism. And so everybody had their own reason for feeling very superior to everybody else. And then suddenly all these scandals happened, and we were all in the same boat, and kind of having to accept that we didn't know how to bring these teachers into America, that maybe we didn't know really very much about what we were doing, who the teachers were, what enlightenment was, what anything meant. But it put us all in the same questioning confusion, and I think that was very helpful to us.
Yeah, questioning confusion, because one of the liberating things about this book is that I think you at one point say the longing for certainty is immature and unattainable. And it's about exploding the notion of certainties and conclusions. So do you feel we're on more secure ground now, or that Western Buddhism is on more secure ground?
I don't think anything's on secure ground these days.
But maybe we know it's insecure now.
I think if anything, we might have more reason, and we might be more willing to accept that we're not on secure ground.
Yes.
So I don't think uncertainty is necessarily more or less than it ever was. I know that that's popular these days, to think that things are much more uncertain than ever. But I think our illusion of uncertainty has changed. That's changed, which is great.
Yes, and most of probably the teachers we're aware of now in the West are Westerners. In other words, the Asians have handed over the baton to some degree, right?
To some degree. Depends on what lineage you're talking about. To some degree. In the Theravada tradition, like the Insight Meditation Society, that's always been led by Westerners.
No.
That's been very different than some of the. Then there's the Zen school, and then the Tibetans, where the Tibetan teachers are still very predominant.
And of course, you're very close to Mingyur Rinpoche and many of the others, and you're still in Nepal much of the time. You were there 2 months ago, as I understand. I'm keen to give everyone else a chance to ask questions, but let me ask you one final one. Please share with everybody why the title is Lotus Girl.
When I was in Nepal in 1965, I used to pass this Tibetan trader every day on my way to a restaurant called Tibetan Blue. And then I would occasionally disappear to work I did volunteer work at a refugee camp in Pokhara, and in the West. And at some point he learned from people at the restaurant where I would pass him to go every day. He learned that I was doing volunteer work there. And I assume I make the assumption that is part of the story. And one day I came back from being in the camp, and he called me over and he handed me this mala. It's actually the same mala. It's been restrung a dozen times because the string breaks and then I lose some of the beads and I have to buy new beads. But he handed this to me. Oh no, he called me over, he said, Lotus Girl. I think it's the Lotus Girl. Lotus Girl. And I was laughing, and he called me over and he put these around my neck, and I said, I can't accept this from you. And he said, no, these you take these Buddha beads to America. And so that's the name Lotus Girl.
And they've been with you 59 years now?
Yeah.
And you took Buddhism to America, among other things.
Something like that. Yeah.
Good. Well, let's open it up to questions. I think there are microphones roaming on the aisles, and lights are probably going to come on. So we'd love to hear your questions.
Is there a particular category within Buddhism that you feel most strongly attracted to? You've referred to Theravada, Mahayana, Zen, Tibetan, but is there one that you feel closest to?
Yes. For many years now, I've been immersed in the Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana. Thank you.
I'll ask you another one while people are gathering their thoughts, which is, what do you think people get wrong about Buddhism? What do we fail to understand?
Where to begin? Well, I think it's been presented as a kind of panacea. I don't think it works that way. As kind of a magic bullet. I certainly had hope for that 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. I think trying to work with your own mind, which for me is the essence of the traditions, and the gentleman asked a question about the different traditions. In the traditions that I've been immersed in, and the ones that I know the best, the essential path relates to working with your own mind. I think that's extremely difficult. I think that the possibility that you're just sitting there, or I was thinking about this today because I was joking with a friend that you say you're going on retreat, and people who don't know what that means says, "Oh, have a great time," like you're going to some spa. You're going to go sit in the hot tub for a week. It can be really very difficult, and I think uprooting the patterns that create so much suffering. I mean, you can, for myself, I could see what the causes of suffering for myself, the routines, the mental spinning, the repetition, where I was caught. I could see that a lot more clearly for a long time before I could actually work with uprooting them. It's a quite a challenging process. It's not in any way easy. It's I would say sometimes hanging out with your fellow Buddhists can be a lot of fun, but the process isn't necessarily a joyride by a long shot. Does that answer your question?
Perfectly. And I think that's why the Dalai Lama always stays very true to that notion of the Buddhist as a physician, or even the Buddhist teacher as a physician.
Yeah.
He can't save anyone from death. nor can he be infallible. And every physician looking at your body or your suffering may give a different diagnosis.
Yeah.
And certain medical systems may be better suited to deal with you and others to deal with me.
Yeah.
So it's very much working with imperfection or limited knowledge, as you were saying. More questions over there?
Thank you.
I see one in the front row if there's a mic.
I have a microphone here, Pico. In practical terms, just to follow up on what you were saying about working with the mind, I'm curious what you actually do, what you've learned from great teachers like Mingyur Rinpoche and the like, what you do when you're assailed by these very difficult emotions, whether it's fear or anxiety or panic or pessimism about the future, all the things that a lot of us are afflicted with at the moment. Is there something you could advise us on? I'm thinking of a close relative of mine who's suffering from panic attacks at the moment, for example. What do you do? What have you learned from Mingyur Rinpoche and the like that's worked for you in terms of dismantling some of this stuff so that you get more equanimity?
Yeah. There's one thing I didn't hear. He said a friend. I didn't hear some.
People dealing with panic attacks.
Panic
and
attacks.
practically speaking, what do you do with all the demons in the head?
So I think one of the first things you do is acknowledge it, not repress it. And you had asked some questions about Buddhism in America and changes here. And certainly one of the things that we got wrong at the beginning was thinking that we were supposed to not have these negative emotions, that it was somehow we were going to become spiritually elevated in some way that was going to render our emotional life unimportant, or we would be dismissive of it, or what didn't matter, it wasn't important. It revealed something about us that we wanted to be sort of holy and above it all. So one of the answers to your question is to acknowledge it, to acknowledge the fear, acknowledge the panic attack, and then figure out something about take a look at where it's coming from. Like right now, let's say you have in relationship to this show that's on. I hope you all have a chance to see the Coal and Ice show that Rachel was talking about. So a lot of us have a lot of fear and panic around the environment. And so one of the questions that would come up is, where is that actually coming from? What is to use the fear as a kind of, like if you have a pain in your tooth, you know there's something wrong. You use it as information that something needs to be healed. So it's valuable information. You don't just want to take a lot of painkillers and pretend it's not there. So if you have like a fear of the environment, what's going on, you could ask, what is the fear? What is it actually bringing up? What is the fear underneath the fear, or what Mingyur Rinpoche will sometimes call the feeling under the feeling? What's there? Why are we so upset about the environment? What does it actually mean to us? What is it that we're losing? What is it that we fear? And so often what happens when we look at those issues, we discover that we tap into something that we might call compassion or love for the environment, for the land, for the earth. And then it would be not how do you approach what we can do about it from the place of fear, but from a place of love. And that can actually shift what our activities are or what our behavior might be.
And it sounds like your story about the Dalai Lama, how can I get over it?
Yeah,
fits in right
exactly.
there. It's not a matter of getting over anything.
Yeah.
Such a good question.
Okay. Hello, thank you so much for sharing generously about your memoir. And one thing that really caught my attention was that you mentioned in the talk that the Buddhism in the West is still in an early stage. So I would like to ask you, what do you see in the future from your perspective?
What do you see in the future?
Yes.
Right now, I don't have a clue. Really. I used to think, I mean, there was a certain time in my life where I thought a lot about the future of Buddhism in America, this in America, that. I don't know. I give up. I don't know. I'm sorry. I just don't know. Doesn't look too good. But I don't know.
That's a liberation, though, don't you think? That's a liberation from the illusion of knowing what's coming tomorrow.
Yeah. You could put it that way.
I have 2 questions for you. I don't know much about the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. But from the conversation we have had today, what appears to me is that you were trying, my understanding is that you were trying to find something. You were suffering, you were in pain, you were in trauma. It could have been the postcard, it could have been that image of the monk who set himself ablaze but was very calm, equanimous. There was something you were trying to get to reach, and that started your journey. In this whole process, you found Buddhism or whatever, the branch that you currently practice. My question is, that is something all of us are looking for. And it could be existential crisis. It could be, who are we? Why do we do what we do? Where are we going? How do we reduce our suffering, which is not different to perhaps what you went through. And you mentioned that you did go through all of that. Over the years, having met all these amazing monks and having the benefit of their teachings, have you found what you were looking for? Have you managed to find a pathway to peace, some way to alleviate that suffering, which I suppose in a way Gautam Buddha himself was looking for? The answer to the end of suffering. So that's the first question for you. Have you that's one. I know it's a very complicated one, but I guess what we are trying to understand, certainly I am, is that perhaps most of us will not be able to do the journey that you did, right? Which is to leave your own home country and find yourself, find the answer. Are you somewhere closer to that? That's one. And two, for those of us who, what are you trying to achieve? What would you like your readers to get out of the book? What is it? What message would you like us to take away after reading your book?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would like you to know that you have much greater capacity to work with your mind than you might think you do, and that you have much greater capacity to, I don't want to bring an end to suffering, but to certainly reduce the suffering, any suffering that you may be in. Most of us, especially I feel in these days, and maybe especially among some of my younger friends, there's a kind of resignation that the world is pretty screwed up and that's just the way it is, and we have to resign ourselves to living in this miserable state. There are exits out of that, and it is. I believe it is through knowing your mind and working with your mind, and it's something that each one of us has. We have everything we need right at this moment to alleviate our own suffering. Everything. Nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be learned. We have it. But we have to somehow recognize that. And that's where the path comes in. We don't seem to be able to recognize it on our own. If we did, we'd all be deliriously happy and enlightened. So we see that we don't have that capacity. And so that's what we use the teachers for. That's what we use the books for, the studies for. We need to have that pointed out to us, it seems. Even though we have it, we don't see it. We remained blind to it. The oldest metaphor for ignorance in the world. We remain blind. So that's what I would If there's any takeaway, it would be that.
I see a question in the front row. I think this gentleman's been...
Oh. Hi. So you were talking about if something was making you suffer, and you were using the environmental crisis as an example, that if you work with your mind and then you approach it from a place of love, you may approach it differently. But what about the usefulness of anger in terms of motivating you not to just sit and suffer, but to do something?
Mm-hmm. It's great.
I'm glad to hear that.
Anger is it's like the toothache. It's like it's a wonderful alarm. Like, what am I so angry about? But if you stick with the anger, then it's a problem. Then because that begins to eat at you. It's not about the other. So anger can be a wonderful echo, a wonderful mirror. You get to look and ask all these questions, and it can certainly bring up useful activity. But if it gets translated into something that's useful, anger can be as an emotion. It can be extremely helpful, but you have to figure out what to do with it. If you just let it sit there and eat up your mind, that's not helpful. We always have that choice. Like, I think everybody knows how serious the climate situation is, but if we're going to stay very angry about it, then we're contributing anger to the world. That doesn't feel very helpful right now. It doesn't mean that the ice is going to stop melting, but the anger itself, if that becomes the collective mode on which we're operating, which seems to be, moral outrage seems to be the popular flavor these days. It doesn't seem very helpful.
You've been waiting patiently for a question.
I'm going to ask you a question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You mentioned just a little while ago that there are times when you can have the awareness, but the change can take a long time, and that you have to sort of sit with the awareness, and then the change eventually comes. And of course, like within the Buddhist framework, there's so many layers to it. And I'm just wondering, like, were there times along your journey that you felt like giving up, or you felt stuck to the point that you were unsure if you could take it all in? And how did you stay inspired during those times when you felt like you weren't changing fast enough?
I didn't hear the
Were there
question.
times when you felt like giving up because the world wasn't, or you were not evolving quickly enough?
Within your own Buddhist practice, like that you weren't, grasping concepts fast enough. How did you stay inspired?
How do you stay inspired? Inspired when things are very difficult.
Well, there are definitely a lot of times when I've lost my inspiration. And for me, that's more or less why I go to hear the teachers. At this point in my life, I'm not going for information. I was never a student that processed information very well, either in high school or college or in Dharma classes. But I can be very inspired, and so it was like getting a kick in the ass, and that's why I would go to retreats with the teachers to have that kind of, that the water kind of bring up to boil. As for giving up, I don't think I ever really thought of just giving up. But I definitely needed to have my inspiration rebooted.
And I feel, having had the advantage which most people haven't of reading the book already, in answer to the earlier question about what you were seeking, I feel this book is a series of cutting through illusions. I feel Manjushri with his sword cutting away one illusion after another. So if it's not about the attainment of wisdom, at least it's about the diminution of ignorance. And although I'm not a Buddhist, I'm guessing that in Buddhism, ignorance is the enemy, and that's what you're trying to cut away at.
Well, I often think of Buddhism as a path of subtraction. We're constantly, so much of the practice is about releasing, allowing for, letting go. And that comes, well, it doesn't come naturally. If it came naturally, we'd all be deliriously happy. But we can see how we get fixated on ideas about who we are that just don't work for us. They don't work to our advantage. And again, our habitual behavior is so deeply rooted. And so much of the process is letting go, seeing that you can't let go, grabbing onto it again, letting go of it again, getting seduced by samsara again, letting go again. And it's very slowly, something gets worn down. And of course the Buddha's promise is that that you are left with something that's essential and very, very good. This sort of non-dualistic, non-conceptual heart, compassionate heart, indiscriminate, compassionate heart. And so the letting go is not a complete annihilation. It can feel that way.
Yeah.
But the support system on the other end is that we have something that's waiting for us.
The liberation.
Yeah.
And also, I think we get fixated on how we think everything else is and how everybody
Absolutely.
else is.
Yes.
And I think one of the things I took away from the book is your 60 years in Buddhism have freed you to some degree from judgment. When you were talking about blame, it's easy to make withering assessments of everything around us. And I think after 60 years, you're probably much less prone to speak in terms of good or bad, or to assume you're in the right.
That's been a hard one to give up, but I'm working on it. I'm still working on it.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things I love in the book is, for example, you have certain political preferences, and there are certain politicians you don't love, I think. And sometimes you've heard, as part of the ritual, your Buddhist teachers praying for all beings, including the ones that you most recoil from. And that's a way of saving you from your assumptions, your prejudices.
Yeah.
And you write very beautifully and honestly about that, which often we forget, because I think so much of life is about solidifying our prejudices rather than trying to let them dissolve in the sense that everything is impermanent and insubstantial. I see a question over there.
Helen, thank you for the book and telling us about it. I'm looking forward to reading it. Many Western Buddhists are Buddhist by choice rather than birth, not all, but many. And therefore, I think Western Buddhism may be taken on a different tact or different direction, as you described it, more secular, less ritual. I guess my question is, what have you found the reaction of your Asian teachers to that evolving style of Western Buddhism? And has there been any sort of feedback loop where it's influenced maybe their own way of teaching?
I didn't quite get it. What is your
I didn't quite get...
So I guess my question was, what was the as Western Buddhism has evolved and you stay close to your Asian teachers, what has their reaction been to how, in a sense, Western Buddhism has evolved? Do they see it as a more diluted version or just kind of the natural evolution of this tradition?
I'm really not sure. I think, first of all, there's a huge, wide variety of teachers we're talking about. It's not a monolithic group like the Asian teachers or the Tibetan teachers. So I don't know. I think that if you, in some cases, I'm thinking specifically of a teacher named Soni Rinpoche, who I think has written quite extensively about ways in which he's learned to accommodate his Western students, that we needed more attention to our hearts and to our feelings, our emotions. And I think several of the Tibetan teachers who may never have talked about emotional material in the past have started to do that more and more. And I think some of that is in response to us and to our questions and our concerns and our behavior. I don't know if that quite answers the question.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Thank you, Helen, and congratulations. This is Noelle. You observed a few minutes ago that one of the great contributions to Buddhism by Western Buddhism was women. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, in the history of Buddhism, as I know it, there are amazing women, but they are very much the exception. And if you look at early photographs of Zen Buddhism in America, let's say in the 50s, and I'm thinking of places like the Cambridge Zen Center that, can't remember her name.
Maureen?
No, the person who started the center, the woman, Johnson.
It's in your book, but
anyway.
Your first book.
If you look at photographs of the early Zen retreats from the 50s, they're all women. And that has something to do with associating Zen at that time with flower arranging and poetry. And it was a kind of the Zen arts, maybe ceramics. And I think at that time in the 50s, the possibility, I mean, not for all men, but for, a lot of these women were married to men who would not consider sitting silently and, quote, doing nothing. That seemed like the antithesis of a man. That the men were not supposed, they were going to be at the office working and making money or whatever men did. And so you see a lot of that was in these early photographs. It's so interesting. And then I'm not sure when that began to shift, but I don't know what the percentages are right now. But even when I was first studying, there were no women teachers. Now I think among the Western teachers, I think it's probably 50-50, I'm not sure. I'm just pulling a number out of a hat, really. But it seems like it's quite even, and if you go to retreats, it seems the same number of men and women. And I think the other area, I don't know how this pans out in all the different traditions, but certainly in the Zen tradition, the presence of the women teachers in the Japanese tradition definitely had an effect on how the Dharma was presented, how it felt, how the meditation halls felt. They weren't so rigid and uptight and, these kind of misogynistic young monks coming by with their keisaku and whacking you on the shoulders as a so-called spiritual practice. The whole thing kind of softened up. And so that certainly is one big effect. And
I think in Asia, it's still very hard to find women teachers. And in Japan, as far as I know, very few women students, and they're not even often allowed because they're seen as distractions. So the notion of men and women sitting zazen together, not going to see so much in Kyoto, I don't think. Yeah, that's a good question. I see a hand over here.
There have been a couple of references to secular Buddhism, certainly in this country. I don't know if this is a fair question. Do you consider Buddhism a religion or a practice?
Is Buddhism a religion or a practice?
This in reference to, there have been a number of references to secular
I used to be very
Buddhism.
interested in that conversation, and somewhere along the line, I just lost my interest in the question. It used to be, is Buddhism a religion? Or not even
Philosophy,
a religion or a philosophy. I had a lot to say on the subject, but I can't remember what it was. I don't know.
That's a very Zen answer.
At this point, I would say it's very hard to make the kinds of transformation that you might think necessary to alleviate your suffering. It's hard to do that without some form of practice. Meditation practice or something, contemplation, I'm not sure what. But it's very hard to make that transition without some activity, some behavior, whether it's in your mind, your body, or on your pillow, whatever. It's got to be more than just something you think about.
Did your question have to do with scandals, or did I mishear? Okay, good. I misheard.
Pico,
excellent.
thanks.
No, you're off the hook. We probably have time for one more question, if there is one. Good.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion tonight, and congratulations, Helen, on your memoir. I'm so curious, when you started Tricycle Magazine, what you considered your objective to be at the time. What did you think was important to communicate, and has that changed over the years?
The poor guy, James Shaheen, who inherited my job, is in the audience. And it's often, we kind of joke about it, but it's not such a joke, that my aspirations when I started were so much, in a way my job was so much easier then than it was now. The job of starting a magazine wasn't easy, but my ideas about what I was doing were so simple. I felt that in a very materialistic society, the idea that materiality, that material goods, that acquiring more stuff was never going to make you happy. That's such a simple idea. There's nothing very esoteric about that. But we were living in a society in which that was like the most radical idea on the planet. The idea that you could actually, that your mind was actually the key to your suffering and the key to your liberation. That was also, this is basic Buddhism. There's nothing esoteric about it, particularly, but it was very radical in our society. I think it's still radical in our society. So to introduce those, that kind of content, that was the objective. Now it's gotten a lot more complicated, but I'm not there anymore, so I don't have to deal with all those complications.
Well, I want to make sure that you have enough time to sign books in the lobby.
Oh,
so
thank
just
you.
a final question.
Okay.
If there were, and there may well be, a 23-year-old woman in this audience who's considering Buddhist practice, what would you say to her?
Well, they're wonderful.
Any warnings or
Warnings.
prompts, directions?
Warnings. Well, a lot of 23-year-olds are obsessed with safe spaces. And I've never quite understood that concept. I don't think the world is safe. I don't know where we ever got this idea that the world was supposed to be safe. I just don't know where that came from. So if what you're looking for, everything has some threat, some possibility of danger, and I hope that it does have some danger. In that, if what you're going towards is some way of working with your mind, of trying to cut through some of the habitual loops of dissatisfaction, I hope that you encounter something so dangerous that it can dislocate that spinning, that pattern of suffering. So in that sense, good luck.
Well, on that rousing note, thank you so much.